The words he has nothing settled over the table like smoke. Aisha said them the way other people say past the salt, casual, automatic, confident that the man sitting 2 feet away couldn't possibly hear, or if he did, wouldn't dare react. And I sat there, and I didn't react. I didn't flinch. I didn't set down my coffee. I didn't even blink, because I had spent 4 years learning exactly how to sit still while the table discussed me like I wasn't there. The man at the next table flinched for me. His name was Imran Malik. He was the CEO of Meridian & Company, the marketing agency where my wife Lavaiza worked, and he was sitting 4 tables away with 2 men in expensive suits and a stack of papers I recognized from the pattern of them, signature pages, term sheets, the kind of documents that come out at the very end of a very long negotiation. His fork had frozen halfway to his mouth the second Aisha said the word nothing, and I watched his eyes dart from my wife's friends to my face and back again, the way a man looks when he realizes the roof he's standing on is about to be pulled out from under him. I gave him the smallest shake of my head. Not yet, Imran. He swallowed, set down his fork, and stared at his plate like it contained the history of everything he'd ever done wrong. Real talk, girls, Lavaiza was saying now, swirling her wine like she was about to make a toast. I'm the one with the career. I'm the one who brings in the salary. Horace is, well. He's my +1. He's there, you know. He's just, there. She laughed. Aisha laughed. Sana laughed. 3 women at a rooftop table overlooking the whole city, and the man who had quietly purchased their city's favorite restaurant years ago was sitting among them, silently, being told that he was nothing. Here's what they didn't know. Here's what Lavaiza didn't know, even though she'd slept next to me for 4 years, even though she'd watched me read my phone at breakfast 1,000 times without ever once asking what was on it. The man who was about to buy the company where her boss worked, the company whose CEO was sitting 4 tables away, sweating into his soup, was me. The deal that had kept Imran Malik up at night for 6 months was my deal. The signature he'd been chasing through lawyers and bankers and one very long due diligence process belonged to me. And I had been waiting, quietly, for 4 years, to see if the woman I married would ever once look at me and ask who I actually was. She never did. So instead, the universe arranged for her boss to be sitting at the next table on the day she told her friends I had nothing. And I was going to let that moment happen, because I had learned that the truth doesn't need to be announced. It just needs to be in the room. Let me tell you the story from the beginning, because the beginning matters. This didn't start with a rooftop brunch and an overheard insult. It started 6 years ago, with a woman in a red dress and a man who had already learned how to be invisible. My name is Haris Khan. I'm 37 years old. I've been married to Lavaiza Shah for 4 years. And for most of that marriage, she has introduced me to people as the one who does the computer thing. This is the story of the day she told her friends I had nothing, and the day her boss heard every word of it. I met Lavaiza 6 years ago, at a Diwali party thrown by a mutual friend in the old money part of the city. She was 29, a senior account director at Meridian & Company, the agency everyone in advertising knew, the one with the glass tower and the awards shelf, and she walked into that party like she owned the building. She was wearing a red dress, and she knew exactly what it did to a room. I was 31, I was wearing a navy blazer I'd owned for 6 years, and I was a founder of a 2-year-old software company that processed payments for restaurants, which sounded impressive if you said it fast and sounded like a hobby if you said it slow. She came up to me, which surprised me, because women like Lavaiza did not usually approach men like me. You look bored, she said. And you're standing next to the only good window in this place. So I'm deciding you're either interesting or you're lost. Which is it? I'm Haris, I said. I'm a little bit of both. She laughed, a real laugh, not the practiced one she'd use later, on party circuits, on her work calls, on everyone except me. Lavaiza, she said, shaking my hand. And what do you do when you're not being interesting and lost, Haris? I build software for restaurants. Payments, ordering, inventory, the plumbing, basically. The stuff nobody sees but everything runs on. That sounds terribly important, she said, and I could tell she didn't believe me for a second. And is it going well, the plumbing? It's going, I said. And that was true, in the way that it's going was true for every founder who was quietly bleeding money while pretending not to. We had 23 people, one whale of a client that paid the payroll, and a valuation that existed only in our own heads. She stayed by my window for the rest of the night. She told me about her work, the clients, the campaigns, the politics, the petty wars with the creative directors, and she was funny and sharp and so alive that I forgot, for 3 hours, that I'd come to that party planning to leave early. At the end of the night she gave me her number, and she said, "Don't make me wait long, Horace from the plumbing." I called her the next morning. Here's what I learned about Lavaiza over the next year. She was brilliant at her job, genuinely brilliant, not the kind of brilliant that comes with a title. She could read a room in 5 seconds and a client in 10. She had opinions about everything and the vocabulary to defend all of them. And she had spent her whole life being told she was exceptional, by parents who had poured everything they had into her education, by bosses who promoted her before they promoted anyone else, by a city that seemed to clear a path for her wherever she walked. Lavaiza did not walk into rooms. Lavaiza arrived in them. And me? I was the quiet one. I was the one who listened. I was the one who paid for dinner and never once mentioned it, who remembered the names of her friends' children, who showed up with her favorite takeout when she'd had a bad day at the office. I was, in every way that mattered to Lavaiza's world, safe. Unthreatening. A man a woman could bring home to her parents without worrying that he'd show her up. Her parents loved me. That should have been my first clue. Her father, Amjad Shah, a retired banker with a voice like gravel, had spent his life measuring men by their titles and their cars, and when I told him I worked in software, he'd nodded once and said, "Respectable." Boring, but respectable, and that had been the end of the conversation. He never asked what software. He never asked how the company was doing. He had filed me under computer thing and moved on with his life, and his daughter, who had inherited every ounce of his confidence and none of his patience, filed me under the same folder. We got engaged 11 months after the Diwali party. I proposed at the restaurant where we'd had our first real date, a little Italian place in the East End that had since gone out of business, taking the romance of the memory with it, but I didn't know that yet. She cried. I cried. She called her mother. Her mother cried. Her father said, "About time," which I chose to hear as a blessing. I asked her, once, if she wanted to know more about my work. We were lying in bed, a month before the wedding, and I'd just come from a meeting that had gone better than I'd ever expected, a meeting that, if it closed, would change the trajectory of my whole company. I was electric with it. I needed someone to tell. "Lavaiza," I said, "something happened today." "Something, I think this could be really big." She rolled over and looked at me, and there was something soft in her face. "Tell me," she said. So I told her. I told her about the meeting, about the client, about what it would mean for the company, for us. And when I finished, she kissed me on the forehead and said, "That's wonderful, love. You're building something real. I'm proud of you." And then she picked up her phone and started scrolling. It wasn't cruelty. It was disinterest. The kind of disinterest that's worse than cruelty, because cruelty at least means you matter enough to hate. Lavaiza didn't hate my work. She just didn't care about it. It was the plumbing. It was the thing her husband did that made him respectable enough to bring home. And somewhere in that bed, with her attention on her phone, I made a decision I never told her about. I stopped talking about my work. Completely. I stopped mentioning meetings, clients, milestones, problems. When she asked how my day was, I said busy or fine or the usual, and she stopped asking follow-up questions, because she'd never really wanted the answers anyway. It wasn't a lie. It was a door I closed, quietly, and she never once knocked on it. That was the year the company began to grow. And it grew without her knowing a single thing about it. Our wedding was small and elegant, the way Lavaiza wanted it, 200 guests, a ballroom in the old Sinclair Hotel, more orchids than I had ever seen in one place. Her father paid for most of it. I offered, and he waved me off with "Keep your money, boy, you'll need it," which I heard the way I heard everything from that family, as a reminder that I was being tolerated, not welcomed. The engagement party was where it started. That's the night I first heard Lavaiza describe me to other people. One of her friends, Aisha, the lawyer, the one who would later laugh at the brunch, cornered her by the bar with a glass of champagne and a question delivered at party volume. "So tell me about this fiancé of yours. What does he do?" Lavaiza glanced at me across the room, where I was talking to her uncle about cricket, and said, "He's in tech. Software. You know. The computer thing." "Software?" Aisha said, arching an eyebrow. "Like, the help desk. Does he fix your laptop?" "He does," Lavaiza said, laughing. "He's fixed mine 100 times. That's the best part, he's useful." They both laughed. It was a small thing. It was a nothing thing. And I filed it away, because I had already started filing things away, the way a man who's been burned once learns to check the smoke detectors. The first year of marriage was good, in the way that first years often are. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a new building downtown. I'd wanted to buy, Lavaiza wanted to rent, until we can afford something proper. I let her win that argument, the way I let her win most arguments, and we signed a lease on a place that cost more than either of our first salaries and found a way to not talk about who actually paid it. We traveled. We hosted dinners. We were the couple that everyone agreed was doing well, which was Lavaiza's favorite phrase and, as I'd learn, her favorite fiction. My company was the thing I never mentioned. By the end of the first year of our marriage, we'd closed the big client, the one from before the wedding, and signed 3 more like it. We had 40 people. We had real revenue, the kind you could show a bank. We moved out of the co-working space into an actual office, and I remember standing in the empty room on the first day, boxes everywhere, my name on the lease, and thinking, I wish I had someone to tell. I had a wife. But I'd closed the door on that conversation a year earlier, and she'd never once tried the handle. So I stood in my empty office and told the walls instead. Meanwhile, the humiliations accumulated, the way water accumulates in a boat, slowly, steadily, one small leak at a time. Her mother's kitchen, the spring of year 1, Nusrat Shah was telling me about her neighbor's son, who had just bought a Mercedes and a house in a gated community. "Some men really know how to take care of their families," she said, stirring the curry, not looking at me. "Alhamdulillah, it's a blessing to have a son-in-law who provides." She wasn't comparing me to anyone. She was comparing me to a standard, and I knew it, and I said nothing, the way I said nothing at most family gatherings. The first anniversary dinner, year 1, I took her to the Astor Room, the rooftop restaurant downtown that everyone wanted a reservation for, the one where I, through a holding company, had quietly become the majority owner 6 months earlier. The maitre d' greeted me by name and walked us to the corner table, the best one in the house, and Lavaiza said, "How did you get this table?" "I've been trying for a year." And I said, "I know the owner," which was true, and she laughed and said, "Of course you do. You know everyone in the service industry. It's your thing." And we ate, and I watched her glow under the restaurant lights, and I didn't tell her that the restaurant was mine, or that the company that processed every credit card on her table was mine, or that I could buy the building we were sitting in if I wanted to. I didn't tell her because she hadn't asked. And I was starting to realize that the woman I'd married was interested in the life I could provide, not the life I actually lived. 6 months into that first year, I did try, once. I really did. We were driving home from her parents' house, and she was complaining about her cousin's husband, who had been pressuring her cousin to quit her job. "Thank God you're not like that," she said. "You've never once asked me to give up anything for your career. You're so easy. It's why I married you." "Easy," I said. "You know what I mean." Low maintenance. You don't need a lot of looking after. Lavaiza, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. What if I told you I'm not as easy as you think? What if I told you there's more to my work than you've ever asked about? She turned and looked at me, and there was a flicker of something, genuine curiosity, maybe, or just confusion. Then she smiled and patted my arm. I know, babe. You're a big important software CEO. I'll be sure to ask you all about it at dinner next week. She said it like a joke, and she meant it like a joke, and I laughed along with her, because that's what I did. And that was the last time I ever tried to tell her. After that night, the door wasn't just closed. It was locked. By the end of year 1, I had stopped being offended by her friends' questions about my job. I had learned exactly what to say. I work in software. Pause for the polite nod. It's not very exciting. That was my whole answer, and it worked, because nobody wanted the real one anyway. The real answer, the one about the company, the revenue, the growth, the 1,000 little decisions that kept 100 families paid, sat in my chest like a stone, and I swallowed it, over and over, for years running. Let me give you the highlight reel of year 2 and year 3, because I need you to understand what 4 years of the computer thing actually looked like, and because I want you to know that on the day it finally broke, I wasn't surprised. I had been watching it break for years. Her birthday, year 2. Aisha organized a lunch at the country club, the one Lavaiza's family belonged to, the one that had a waiting list and a dress code and a cappuccino machine that probably cost more than my first car. I wore the blazer. Lavaiza wore something that made the other women at the table do that thing where they adjust their chairs. The conversation turned, inevitably, to careers. One of the women, I don't remember her name, I remember her rings, asked Lavaiza what I did, and Lavaiza said, he works from home, mostly. He's very supportive. He handles everything so I can focus on my job. And then she changed the subject to her new campaign, and nobody at that table so much as glanced at me, because the man who handles everything is not a subject, and the woman who focuses on her job is the one the room is for. I sat there with a pulled pork sandwich and a glass of sweet tea and watched my wife introduce me to her world as a supporting character. It wasn't mean. It wasn't even intentional. It was just true, from her point of view. I was the one at home, in my home office, in my sweatpants, doing the thing she'd filed under computer. She had no idea that the office she thought I had was me, because I'd stopped telling her, and she'd stopped asking. The office Christmas party, year 3. Meridian and company threw a party at a venue downtown, and I went as Lavaiza's +1, which is a very particular kind of humiliation when you've been married 3 years. She introduced me to her coworkers as Horace, my husband, he's in software, and then the conversation would drift around me like water around a stone. At one point I overheard her by the bar, talking to a colleague, a woman with a pixie cut who asked how her husband was doing. Oh, he's good, Lavaiza said. He has his little projects. Honestly, I don't ask, it's all very complicated and very boring. The colleague laughed. Men, she said. They love their toys. And Lavaiza said, mine's not even the expensive kind of toy. She said it affectionately. That's what made it land. It wasn't a knife, it was a paper cut, one of 1,000, and paper cuts hurt more, because you can't point to them without looking like you're overreacting. Her father's 70th birthday, year 3. Amjad Shah stood up at the dinner and made a speech about his daughters, about Lavaiza, the exceptional one, the director, the one who'd made him proud at Meridian, and about her sister Rania, the doctor, the one who'd saved lives during the pandemic. He talked about his family's legacy, about the Shah name, about the future his grandchildren would inherit. He did not mention me. Not once. I sat at a table with 40 of his closest friends and relatives, and the man's own son-in-law was invisible to him, not maliciously, just factually, the way you don't mention the furniture. My mother-in-law noticed, though. Later that night, in the kitchen, she said to me, gently, like she was being kind, Horace, Beta, you should think about your career now. You're not getting younger. Lavaiza carries so much. A wife can't be the provider forever. I looked at her for a long moment, and I thought about the wire transfer I'd made that morning, a number that would have covered every expense in her house for a decade, and I said, "Yes, Amy. I'll think about it." And she patted my cheek and went back to the party, and I stood by the window and thought about how strange it is, to be the richest man in a room and the smallest one in it at the same time. The Sunday dinners. The 180 Sunday dinners. That's the number that gets me. Over 4 years, Lavaiza and I had Sunday dinner at her parents' house roughly 180 times, and in all those hours, at all those tables, no one ever asked me a single question about my company. Not one. Her father asked about cricket. Her mother asked about children, that question, 180 times, with increasing urgency and decreasing patience. Her sister asked about travel. Aisha, when she was there, asked about my cute little hobby business. But nobody asked what I did. Nobody asked how it was going. Because everybody in that family had already decided, 4 years earlier, when I'd said the word software and her father had nodded and moved on, that there was nothing underneath it to ask about. I want you to understand that I'm not a bitter man. I want you to understand that I loved my wife, and that I still believe she loved me, in the way that she understood love, as something you say, not something you build. She wasn't a villain. She was a woman who had never once been forced to look at me closely, because her family, her friends, and her own confidence had all conspired to tell her there was nothing worth looking at. But I am also a man who kept receipts, not on paper, in memory, and I had every word she'd ever said about me filed away, with dates, the way I'd filed away every vendor invoice in the early days of my company. Not because I planned to use them. Because that's the thing nobody tells you about being called nothing for years, you memorize it. You memorize every version of it, the way you memorize the creak in a floorboard, because your brain wants to know when it's coming for you again. And once a year, roughly, I would go to a meeting that would have made every single one of those people stop mid-sentence. I would sit across a table from bankers and lawyers and men who ran companies 10 times the size of Meridian, and they would call me Mr. Khan and mean it. And then I would come home, and my wife would ask if I'd had a good day, and I would say fine, and she would nod, and we would order dinner, and I would go to sleep next to a woman who had decided, without malice, that I was nothing. I remember the exact moment I stopped hoping she'd ever ask. It was a Tuesday, about 3 months before the brunch. The Series C had just closed, $210 million valuation, the biggest financing round in our company's history, and I had spent the day in a room with 50 people who had bet their careers on me. I came home buzzing, the way you'd come home from a war that you won. Lavaiza was on the couch, on her phone, and she looked up and said, "You're late. Did you remember to pick up the dry cleaning?" "I did," I said. "It's in the car." "Good," she said, and went back to her phone. And I stood in my own hallway, in my own apartment, in my own expensive silence, and I understood that the woman I'd married was never going to see me. Not because she was cruel. Because she had never once, in 4 years, looked. And I thought, okay. Then I'll let the world show her. I just didn't know the world would arrange to do it on a Saturday afternoon, with her boss at the next table. So let me tell you about Imran Malik, because you deserve to know the kind of man who was sitting at the next table, and you deserve to know how he got there. Imran, in his late 50s, had built Meridian and Company from a 2-desk shop in the 90s into the city's biggest independent agency. He was the old-school kind, handshake deals, Sunday morning phone calls, a memory for every client the firm had ever lost and why. He wasn't flashy. He didn't do panels. He didn't do TED Talks. He did what the industry had forgotten how to do: he showed up, he answered the phone, he kept his promises. And he'd spent the last 2 years watching his agency get eaten from both sides, the big networks poaching his senior talent, the digital firms undercutting his retainers, his own board whispering that it was time to sell while the selling was still good. I had been his client for 3 years. Quietly. One of the accounts that pays the bills and never makes the real the hospitality group's loyalty program, the restaurant chain's internal systems, work that never got a trophy because it wasn't the kind of work that wins trophies. It was the kind of work that wins. And somewhere in the third year, Imran started staying late in my meetings, asking questions that weren't about the account, and one evening, over bad coffee in his office, he asked me the question that had clearly been burning a hole in him for months. "Horace," he said, "who are you, really? Because I've been in this business 30 years, and I've never met a client who reads the contracts the way you do. And every time I look up, your company's gotten bigger. You're the quietest man I've ever done business with, and I know that's deliberate." I liked him for asking. I liked him because in 3 years, he was the only person in the city attached to Lavaiza's world who had ever looked at me and wondered what was underneath. "Imran," I said, "what would you say if I told you I've been thinking about buying an agency?" He laughed. "I'd say you're about 2 years late. Everybody's buying or being bought. The question is whether you can find one that's still worth anything. What about yours?" The coffee sat between us. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, "My board wants me to sell to a network. They want the exit, the earn-out, the pat on the head. They don't care what happens to the name or the people." He paused. "I don't want to sell to a network. I want to know the people who've been carrying my clients for 30 years still have jobs next year. Which is why I'm going to tell you something I haven't told anyone, Horace. If the right buyer walked in, with the right reasons, I'd hand them the keys myself." That was the beginning. 6 months of it, due diligence, valuations, lawyers who billed by the hour and talked in percentages, board calls that went nowhere, an exclusivity letter, a renegotiated valuation, 100 small wars over 100 small clauses. Imran never once blinked. He fought for his people the way other men fight for their own bonuses, staff retention guarantees, no mass layoffs for 24 months, the office kept, the name kept. By the end, I respected him more than I'd respected almost anyone I'd ever done business with. And I'd quietly made sure the deal he was signing was the deal he actually wanted. The documents were set to close Monday morning, 9 a.m. The lawyers had scheduled a final working session for Saturday afternoon to put the finishing touches on the signature pages, the same Saturday my wife's friend Aisha had chosen, weeks earlier, for a rooftop brunch. Now here's the part that still makes me shake my head when I think about it. The rooftop restaurant Aisha picked, the one with the reservation list a mile long, the one where you had to know someone to get a table near the rail, was a property my holding company had acquired 2 years earlier. Not because I was trying to be clever. Because the hospitality group had come with it, and it was a good asset, and I was in the business of buying good assets. Nobody at that brunch knew it. The maitre d' knew it. The manager knew it. The chef knew it. But the 3 women who were about to discuss my net worth at a table on my roof had no idea that the roof belonged to the man they were discussing. Imran's lawyers had booked a table by the window, the privacy booth, the one with the good light, and Imran had arrived early with his gray suit and his stack of papers, because Imran was the kind of man who shows up early to everything, including his own surrender. And Lavaiza had arrived at 12 with her friends, radiant and laughing, and kissed me on the cheek like I was the pleasant part of her day, and sat down at a table on the other side of the rail from her boss of 11 years, who did not recognize her at first. Because he had never once seen her at a restaurant like this on a Saturday with her hair down. I recognized him. And when he recognized me, when his fork froze and his eyes went wide and he started to rise, I gave him the smallest shake of my head. "Not yet," I mouthed. "Stay." And because Imran Malik was a soldier who had spent 6 months learning to trust me with everything he had built, he sat back down, and he watched, and he waited. He had no idea he was about to watch my wife tell the world I had nothing. But I did. I had been waiting for this exact moment for 4 years, I just didn't know, until I saw Lavaiza wave me over to her table on the roof of my own building, exactly which part of my life she was going to perform today. The brunch started the way every brunch with Lavaiza's friends started, with her performing, and me performing the role she'd written for me. She ordered for the table, she always ordered for the table, and the waiter, who knew my face from the Tuesday walkthroughs, looked at me for a half-second longer than he should have, and I gave him a tiny nod, and he went to fetch the champagne. "He's so considerate," Aisha said, watching me pull out Lavaiza's chair. "Haris, tell me, what's it like, being married to the most successful woman in your family?" I smiled. "It's simple," I said. "I bring the purses, she brings the paycheck." They laughed. All three of them. Lavaiza patted my arm, delighted, because I had said the line she expected, the line that confirmed everything they'd already decided about me. I had gotten very good at that line over 4 years. I had delivered it at 100 dinners, 100 brunches, 100 gatherings where the only thing expected of me was to be small and pleasant and grateful. It was the role. And I had learned, the way you learn any craft, to play it perfectly. The conversation moved the way their conversations always moved. Aisha's new case, a famous one, a celebrity divorce, she let us know the names without telling us the names. Sanaa's renovation, her contractor had run off with the deposit, she'd gone to small claims, she told the story like it was a victory. Lavaiza's campaign, the big retail account, the one her boss had handed her personally, the one she was told to protect at all costs. Me, at the end, like dessert, except nobody ever ordered dessert. "Haris," Aisha said, "is it true you work from home? What do you do all day?" "Relax." "I work," I said. "I have meetings. I run reports. It's dull, honestly." "Dull is comfortable," Sanaa said, as if she'd just said something profound. "Lavaiza, you're so lucky. My husband is always traveling, always busy. At least yours is, around. Dependable." "Very dependable," Lavaiza agreed, and there was something in her voice that I knew well, the tone she used when she was about to make a joke at my expense and wanted to make sure the table was listening. She leaned forward, wine in hand, and said, "Honestly, girls, do you know what my friends at work call him? The invisible husband. They've been to our apartment a dozen times, the Christmas party, the housewarming, the dinners, and half of them couldn't pick him out of a lineup. There's a running bet about what he actually does all day." She laughed, the bright kind, the kind that invites everyone in. "I told them he's probably just watching YouTube. Better that than messing with my accounts, right?" Aisha cracked up. Sanaa cracked up. Waiters carried trays around us like we were invisible. And I sat there, 14 feet from my wife's boss, and I smiled. "Right," I said. "Just the YouTube. That got them going." That was the thing about my role, if I accepted the joke was over, and the room moved on. If I let it land, if I showed even half a second of discomfort, it became a feast. I had learned, over 4 years, to feed the joke exactly enough to end it. Keep it alive, and it would eat me. I had learned that the table would always move on, because none of them were ever looking at me anyway. But Aisha wasn't done. Aisha was never done. She leaned in, elbows on the table, the way she did when she was about to deliver a verdict, and she said, "No, but seriously, Lavaiza. I've never understood it. You're a director at Meridian. You run the biggest account in the agency. You've got the title, the apartment, the whole life. And your husband, bless him, he's sweet, don't get me wrong, but what does he bring? I mean, really. What does he actually bring to the table?" And that's when Lavaiza said it. She shrugged, and she swirled her wine, and she said, without a pause, in the voice of a woman stating a simple fact. "He has nothing. He's lovely, you know, but he has nothing." The words landed on the table like they'd been there all along. Aisha nodded, satisfied, like the verdict had been confirmed. Sanaa nodded too, a little slower, the way people nod when they're agreeing with something they hadn't thought of themselves but are relieved to hear anyway. And Lavaiza, my wife, the woman who slept in the same bed as me, the woman who had watched me leave for meetings 4 days a week for years without once asking who the meetings were with, took a sip of wine and looked out at the city, beautiful and satisfied, like she had just won a point. I looked past her, over the rail, at the table by the window, where Imran Malik's fork had stopped halfway to his mouth. There it is, Imran. The woman who's about to become your boss's wife. The conversation rolled on without me, the way it always did. Aisha moved to real estate, she and her husband were looking at houses, and the market, and how they'd probably have to pay cash to compete. Sana mentioned her husband's bonus. Lavaiza mentioned a trip she wanted to take, Milan, in the spring, for fashion. Nobody asked me about vacations, because I was the one who stayed home. Nobody asked me anything at all. I checked my phone under the table. 3 messages. One from my CFO about Monday. One from my lawyer with the final countdown. One from the manager of this restaurant, asking if everything was to my satisfaction, because the manager had seen my name at the top of the booking manifest and knew better than to make a scene about it. I typed back, everything is perfect. Watch the table by the rail. And I set my phone down, face up, and waited for the moment that would change the rest of my life. If you're enjoying this story and want to see what happened when the table finally went quiet, and trust me, you want to see it, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me what you'd have done in my place. And if you've ever been the person the room talks over, share this with somebody who needs to hear it. Let's get back to it. You know what's funny, Lavaiza? I said, and my voice was calm, the calm you get when you've been preparing for a moment for 4 years and it finally arrives. Every single thing you've said about me today, about the invisible husband, about the nothing, your boss has heard every word of it. Lavaiza blinked. My boss. I nodded toward the rail. Imran Malik is sitting at that table by the window, Lavaiza. He's been there for the last hour. He heard you call me the invisible husband. He heard, what does he bring to the table? He heard, he has nothing. The rooftop went very, very quiet. Lavaiza's head turned toward the window table slowly, the way your head turns toward a crash you already know is yours. Imran Malik was sitting there, stone still, his gray suit all wrong for a Saturday rooftop, his papers stacked in front of him like armor, his eyes locked on our table. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just sat there, a witness who had been sworn in an hour ago and was waiting to be called. Oh my God, Lavaiza whispered. Oh my God, Imran. He's been there the whole time. He heard, she turned back to me, and alarm was sliding into something else now, something that looked a lot like anger. Why didn't you tell me he was there? Why didn't you warn me? Why would I warn you, Lavaiza? I said. I didn't know you were planning to perform. Aisha laughed, the nervous kind, the kind that comes from a woman who has just realized the wall she's been leaning on for an hour wasn't a wall. Okay, this is crazy. This is crazy. Haris, what are you doing? Is this a bit? Is this part of some joke? Because Imran Malik doesn't do brunches, Haris. He barely does lunches. He's probably here for work. You're saying he just happened to overhear. He's here for work, I said. He's here with lawyers. They're finalizing the paperwork for the sale of Meridian and Company before the closing on Monday morning. The word sale landed on the table like a stone. Sale. Sana said. Meridian is being sold. Lavaiza, did you know about this? Lavaiza was staring at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, a kind of slow, dawning confusion, the look of a woman who believes she's been reading a book this whole time and has just realized every page is in a language she doesn't know. There's been talk, she said, her voice thin. There's been talk about a sale for months. Nobody knows who the buyer is. They've kept it locked down. Everyone thinks it's a network, a big one, someone with deep pockets. She shook her head. What does that have to do with anything, Haris? Why would you bring up the sale? Why would you? Lavaiza, I said. Who do you think is buying the company? The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever been part of. It was the silence of three women doing math in their heads and arriving, one by one, at the same impossible answer. Aisha got there first. I watched it happen on her face, the confusion, then the unbelief, then the slow horror of a smart woman realizing she had just spent an hour mocking a man she should have been terrified to offend. Sana got there second, her mouth falling open, her hand going to her neck. And Lavaiza got there last, because she had the most to unlearn. No, she said. No. That's not, you don't, she was shaking her head, but her eyes had gone to the manager, who was standing at the door of the kitchen, watching our table, waiting for his owner's signal. You don't own a company that buys agencies. You work from home. You have meetings. She said the word meetings like it was a confession. You have your little projects. Your computer thing. I do have meetings, I said. You've never asked where they are. Your mother has never asked. Aisha has never asked. Nobody has ever asked, Lavaiza, because asking would mean admitting there might be something behind the door, and nobody in your family wanted to find out there was. The manager approached the table. He was a man in his 40s named Ravi, a decade in hospitality, and he had been watching the scene unfold from the kitchen door for 10 minutes because he'd recognized the name on the manifest and the face in the corner booth, and he knew, the way the whole staff knew, that the quiet man who owned the building, the one who bought the restaurant chain outright in cash, was sitting with three women who had just spent an hour discussing him like he was a stray. Mr. Khan, Ravi said, low, deferential, in the tone he used for exactly one person in this building. Is everything to your satisfaction? Everything is perfect, Ravi, I said. Thank you. Please have the kitchen send out the full tasting menu to the table by the window, Mr. Malik's table. It's on me. And bring the car around. Of course, sir. He was gone before anyone at the table could breathe. And I watched three women process what they had just seen, the manager of the most exclusive rooftop brunch in the city, deferring to the man they'd introduced as a +1. Haris. Aisha's voice had gone high and careful, the voice of a lawyer suddenly worried she's on the wrong side of a deposition. Haris, who are you? What is this? I'm going to tell you, Aisha, I said. I'm going to tell you exactly who I am. And then I'm going to tell Lavaiza who I've always been, and I'm going to let her decide what that means for the rest of our lives. But first, I looked across the rail at Imran Malik, who was rising from his table, papers in hand, because the trap I had set for my wife was also, it turned out, the moment her boss had been waiting 6 months to have. First, I need to say hello to the man who's been waiting all afternoon to meet the buyer. Imran Malik crossed the rooftop like a man who had been waiting for this moment through 6 months of lawyers and valuations, and when he reached our table he didn't look at Lavaiza at all. He looked at me, and he extended his hand, and he said, in the voice of a man finally saying something out loud, Mr. Khan. His handshake was firm and dry, the handshake of a man who had just chosen his legacy. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about me. Imran, I said. Forgive me. I had a family obligation. Family obligation, he repeated, and for a split second his eyes flicked to Lavaiza, the director who had never once, in 11 years at his company, mentioned that she was married to the man who was buying it. Then he looked away, the way polite men look away from things that aren't their business, and gestured at the papers in his hand. The lawyers wanted another 30 minutes on the indemnities. I told them they'd had 6 months. The documents are ready, Haris. Monday, 9 o'clock. Meridian will be yours. The word yours did it. I watched it hit Lavaiza like a physical blow, the way her spine straightened, the way her hand closed around her wine glass until the knuckles went white, the way her breath stopped for a second and then came back fast and shallow. She was a woman watching her life get recategorized in real time, and she was doing it in front of her 2 best friends and her boss of 11 years, and there was nowhere to look but at me. Imran, she said, and her voice cracked on his name. Imran, I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were here. I didn't know about the sale. Nobody's told us anything, the board's been so tight-lipped, she was already backpedaling, already performing, already trying to find the version of this moment where she came out looking good. I'm so sorry for anything I said. The girls were just joking around. The invisible husband thing, it's an inside joke, it's nothing, it's Lavaiza. Imran's voice was gentle, which was somehow worse. You don't owe me an apology. You said what you said. The man who's about to own the company you work for heard you say it. That's not my business either. He looked at me. Am I needed here, Horace? Or shall I leave you to your family obligation? I almost smiled. Give us 5 minutes, Imran. Then I'd like to introduce you to my wife properly. Take your time. He nodded once, to me, only me, and walked back to his table by the window, where his lawyers were pretending very hard not to have heard any of it. The way he moved through the room told the whole story. The man who had been negotiating for his own surrender for 6 months had just watched the wife of his buyer spend an hour humiliating him in public, and all he'd done was say Mr. Khan, shake the buyer's hand, and walk away. In 30 years of this business, Imran had learned exactly one rule worth keeping: never get between a man and his reckoning. I turned back to the table. It was very quiet. Lavaiza, I said, do you want to know who I am? Actually no. Not the version your parents decided I was at dinner. Not the computer thing. Not the invisible husband. The actual man, the one who has been sleeping in your bed for 4 years. Her eyes were wet. Good. I needed her eyes wet. I needed her to feel the shape of the words before she had to answer for them. Yes, she whispered. I think I want to know. So I told her. I told her about the company, the one she'd filed under hobby, the payment processing platform that now handled transactions for more than 3,000 restaurants across the country. I told her about the offices, the team, the rounds. I told her about the valuation that had closed 3 months earlier, a number that made her father's entire net worth look like a rounding error, and I watched her do the math, and I watched the math land on her face like a verdict. You know the restaurant we're sitting in? I said. I own it. I've owned it for 2 years. The manager who just brought coffee to your friend's table is my employee, Lavaiza. The building is mine. The lease is mine. The company that processes every card that gets swiped at every table on this roof is mine. I paused, because I wanted the next part to land with the weight it deserved. And the agency you've given 11 years of your life to, the one where you are a director, the one with the biggest account in the building, the one whose CEO you just told your friends, I'm buying it on Monday. Which means that as of Monday, when you walk into that office, you will be walking into my building. You will be sitting at a desk, in a company that is owned by your husband, the husband you just spent an hour telling your friends has nothing. Aisha made a sound, a small, strangled sound, the sound of a lawyer who has just met the hostile witness. Sana was staring at her plate. And Lavaiza was crying. Not the pretty kind. The kind that comes up from somewhere deep, the kind that means the ground you've been standing on your whole life just turned out to be paper. Why didn't you tell me? She said. Horace. Why didn't you ever tell me? All these years. Every dinner. Every Sunday at my parents' house. You sat there while my mother told you to think about your career. You let my father forget you. You let Aisha make her jokes. Why didn't you just tell me? I would have. Would you have what, Lavaiza? I said, and for the first time all afternoon, something hard came into my voice. Would you have believed me? Think about the first time I tried. 4 years ago, in the car, coming home from your parents' house. I told you there was more to my work than you ever asked about. You laughed. You called me a big important software CEO, do you remember that? You made it a joke, Lavaiza, and I laughed along, because that's what I did. That's what I always did. I performed my role. I played the invisible husband. I brought the purses and I smiled at the jokes and I let your family file me away, and not once in 4 years, did anyone in that family ask me a single question about what I actually did with my days. The table was silent. Lavaiza's tears were falling into her lap. I stopped telling you because you stopped asking, I said. It's that simple. I tried, once, and you laughed, and I decided that the man you married, the one with the little projects, the one who was just there, was the man you actually wanted. So I gave him to you. I gave you exactly the husband you asked for. The only thing I didn't do was tell you the price. What price? She whispered. The price, I said, is that the woman I love has been married, for 4 years, to a man she has never seen. I have been sitting across from you at 180 family dinners, and you have not once looked at me. I have built the kind of life most people in that family can't even dream about, and I have built it alone. I have been rich for years, Lavaiza, and I have been the poorest man in the city, because I have been completely, totally unknown to the one person who was supposed to know me better than anyone. I let it sit. Let it settle into the silence of the rooftop, into the wine glasses, into the shocked faces of her friends. Imran knows who I am, I said finally. My CFO knows. My lawyers know. The manager of this restaurant knows. The only person in the world who didn't, the only one who had a seat at the table for every single hour of it, was you. The next hour was the strangest hour of my life, and I want to tell you some of it, because the aftermath is where the truth lives. Imran came back to the table when he saw me stand. I introduced him to Lavaiza, properly, formally, the way you introduce a man's boss when the boss is about to become his employee. She shook his hand with a dead woman's grip and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Malik," and he said, "Thank you, Lavaiza. I'll see you Monday," and he looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that I will never forget. Not pity. Not judgment. It was respect, the respect of a man who had watched another man make peace with the thing that had been bothering him for years. Aisha found her voice before he left. "Haris," she said, and her voice had that careful, negotiating quality I'd heard 1,000 times in boardrooms. "I want to say, the things I said today. About what you bring to the table. We were just joking around. I had no idea. I hope you know that none of it was." "Aisha," I said, "you've been laughing at my job for 4 years. You laughed today, at this table, in front of my wife. Now you're upset because the man you were laughing at turned out to be worth more than everyone you've ever laughed with combined. I'm not interested in your apology, and I'm not interested in your fear. I'm interested in one thing only, what my wife does with the next 5 minutes, because that's the only thing in this story that was ever going to matter to me." Aisha went quiet. On a normal day, she would have had a comeback. But there was nothing in her whole professional toolkit for this situation, the moment where the joke she'd been making for years stood up, put on its jacket, and turned out to own the building. Lavaiza sat there, tears dried by then, staring at the table like the pattern in the wood held the answer to a test she hadn't studied for. And then, slowly, she looked up at me, really looked, the way she used to look at me in the beginning, before the wedding, before her parents filed me away, before she learned to perform for her friends. It was the first time in years that she had looked at me, all the way to the back of me, like I was a person instead of a piece of the set. "Can I come and see it?" she asked. "Your office. Your company. Can I see it?" It was such a small sentence. Such a small question, from a woman who had spent 4 years not knowing the shape of her own husband's life. And it undid me, a little, in a way the 7 years of jokes never could. Because it was the first question she had ever asked that I had been waiting 4 years to answer. "Yes," I said. "Tomorrow. I'll show you all of it. Monday morning, 9 o'clock, the closing. I don't need to tell you the details, the boardroom, the lawyers, the signatures, the handshakes that made the deal real. Imran Malik signed his name on the last page, and I signed mine on the line above the one that said purchaser, and he looked at me across the table and said, "They're good people, Horace. Every single one of them. Don't let my successor forget that." And I said, "Your successor won't," and I meant it, because the retention plan was mine, and the people were the reason I'd bought the place instead of letting some network carve it up and sell the parts. Lavaiza was there. I'd asked her to come, not as a director, not as my wife, but as a witness. She sat at the back of the boardroom in a gray suit, the one she wore to her own big meetings, and she watched her boss of 11 years hand the keys of the company to her husband, and she didn't say a word. Afterward, in the hallway, Imran said goodbye to her with a warmth that surprised me. "Lavaiza, you've been the best of this place for a decade. I'll tell the new owner to look after you," and she laughed, for the first time in 2 days, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and she said, "I think he already knows me, Mr. Malik." Word travels in a company the way rumor travels in a family, fast, distorted, and impossible to stop. By Wednesday, everyone at Meridian knew the buyer's name. By Friday, they knew he was Lavaiza's husband. The whispers in the kitchenette, the eyes in the elevator, the "oh my God" that followed her into the conference room, she bore it all, and she came home that night, and she said, "Everyone at work thinks I married you for the money. They think I knew. They think I've been sitting on the secret for years, playing dumb so I could what, look down my nose at you in public. It's insane. Nobody believes the truth, that I married a man I didn't even know. Nobody believes it," I said, "because it's the most honest thing you've ever told anyone about our marriage, and your coworkers have spent 4 years watching the lie instead." She took it. She took it without flinching, which was the most I'd ever seen her handle in one night, and she said, "Then I guess I have to start telling the truth. I have to learn who you are. I've got years of catching up to do, and it's going to make me miserable, and it's going to be the most honest thing I've ever done." The family dinner was the following Sunday. Her parents' house. 181st Sunday at that table, and I walked in the way I always walked in, quietly, smiling, ready to be filed away under the computer thing. Her mother kissed my cheek. Her father asked about cricket. Her sister Rania asked about travel. And then, before anyone could ask about children, Lavaiza set down her fork and said, in a voice that cut through the chatter like a blade, "Ami. Abu. I have something to tell you, and I need you to listen." You could have heard a pin drop. The Shaws were not a family that listened to Lavaiza, they were a family that basked in her. But something in her voice made her mother set down the ladle. Made her father look up from his plate. "I've been married for 4 years, Lavaiza said, to a man I never looked at. A man you never looked at either, because you decided, on the day you met him, that he was the computer thing, that he was nothing." Her voice wobbled, and she steadied it. "I was wrong. We were wrong. And you need to know that the man who has been sitting at this table for 4 years, being asked about cricket and children," she looked at me, and her eyes were bright, "owns more than this entire family together. He owns buildings, Ami. He owns companies. He owns the place where I work. And he never once used that against any of us, even when we were using him for a punchline." The silence at that table was the absolute silence of 4 years of assumptions collapsing at once. Her mother's face went through 3 shades. Her father looked at me like I was a document he'd been reading upside down his whole life. Her sister Rania, the doctor, the one everyone agreed was the sensible one, said, very slowly, "Is this true, Horace?" And I said the 7 words I had been waiting to say for 4 years, in the same quiet tone I'd used to accept her mother's advice about my career, to thank her father for the cricket chat, to be the invisible husband at 180 tables just like this one. "It's true," I said. "It's been true for a long time. I just never got asked." It was her mother who cried first. Amjad Shah, who had measured me for years and found me wanting, sat at the head of his own table and said nothing at all, and I watched him chew on it, the way a proud man chews on the moment his whole worldview bit him. It wasn't cruelty, his silence. It was grief, grief for the years his family had spent polishing themselves in a mirror that had another man's fortune reflected back the whole time. I didn't rub it in. I didn't need to. The truth doesn't need to be announced, I'd learned. It just needs to be in the room. And on that Sunday night, for the first time in its history, the truth sat down at the Shah's dinner table and stayed. Here's what I want you to take from this story, and I'm telling you this because I think you've either been the person at that table or you've been the table. The invisible husband doesn't exist. Neither does the woman who hangs on her husband's arm while dismissing him to her friends. What exists is a marriage, two people, four eyes, and all the years they waste not looking. I was as guilty as anyone. I hid from my own wife, let her family file me away, chose the performance every single time over a fight I didn't think I could win. The door was locked on both sides. But here's the other thing, the thing I'm most proud of, the thing I'd want you to remember when you're the one being told you have nothing. I didn't buy that agency to prove a point to my wife. I bought it because I knew Imran's people, I knew the work, and I knew that a company full of good people was being sold to a network that would gut them. I had the money, so I bought it, and I made sure the people I'd been watching for years kept their jobs. Do you understand how good that felt? Not the reveal at the rooftop, the reveal was just the moment the truth became visible. The good part, the part that got me through 4 years of being nothing, was standing in that warehouse on the west side at midnight, painting lines on a floor with a guy named Sal, while the company that nobody in my family knew I owned prepared to open its doors. The good part is that I never became like them. I never needed anyone to know I had something, so I kept building, and the building was the reward, and the woman who finally, looked at me was the one who got to see what I'd been carrying all along. And Lavaiza? She resigned from Meridian a month later. Not because she couldn't work for her husband, she said she didn't want her first real look at our marriage to be clouded by anyone's assumptions. She took a job at a smaller agency, one where the title was hers and hers alone, and she came home one night with her first paycheck from that job, and she set it on the kitchen counter, and she said, "This is the first thing I've earned in years that I'm proud of on my own terms. I want you to know it, because you've been earning things on your own terms for years, and I never noticed." She's learning me now. Slowly. In fits and starts, the way you learn a city you've driven through for years without a map. She asks questions now, real ones, with follow-ups, and her father no longer asks about cricket first. He asks about the company. He asks like he's making up for lost time, and maybe he is, and maybe there isn't enough lost time to make up for, but the question is what matters. The question is the whole thing. The office, when I showed it to her that first time, was the thing that finally made her cry. Not the corner office. Not the valuation. It was the wall of photos in the break room, the Christmas parties, the bowling nights, the first warehouse, the team that had built all of it with me, and she walked the wall slowly, the way you walk a timeline, and she stopped at a picture from 4 years ago, me and Sal, painting the floor lines on the west side, covered in paint, laughing like idiots. She stood there for a long moment, and then she said, "This is who you were. This is who you really were, the whole time. And I never came to visit." "No," I said. "You never came to visit. But I'm here now." And she is. She's here now, in the offices, at the dinners, at the 181st Sunday and the ones after it. The man who had nothing, it turns out, has everything, not because he bought it, but because he built it, quietly, alone, and then had the grace to let the people who dismissed him find out in their own time. Last month, her mother called me. Just me, not Lavaiza, first. She said, "Haris Beta, I want you to know something. You are the best thing that has ever happened to this family. And I'm sorry it took us so long to say it." I said, "Thank you, Amy. Aren't you angry?" She asked. "After everything? Aren't you angry at us?" I thought about it. The 180 dinners. The gas cards I didn't get, the jokes I did. The woman at the rooftop, telling her friends I had nothing, while at the next table her boss waited to shake the buyer's hand. "No," I said. "I'm not angry." And I meant it. I was never the burden in that room, Amy. I was just the only one who knew it. Because that's the last thing I want to tell you, and it's the realest thing in this whole story. People will call you nothing, endlessly, warmly, without malice, and the whole time, the truth is just sitting there, waiting to be in the room. You don't have to announce it. You don't have to prove it. You just have to keep building, and the day will come when the people who dismissed you get to watch it walk in the front door, wearing your face, holding your hand. That was the scene Lavaiza's boss watched from the next table. And the man who had nothing, the one the last 3 years of my wife's life kept telling everyone was nothing, was the man about to sign the papers that closed the deal on the agency where her boss had worked for 30 years. She told her friends I had nothing, on a rooftop I owned, in a building I bought, at a table served by my employees. And the whole time, at the next table, sat the proof. The funny thing is, I didn't plan it that way. I planned the quiet part, the building, the buying, the patience. But the rooftop, the brunch, the words, the boss, that was just the universe finally getting the joke. 7 years of being called a burden taught me that the only opinion that matters is the one you hold about yourself. And 4 more years of being called nothing taught me the rest. The truth doesn't need to be announced. It just needs to be in the room.